swore an oath to God to protect his name, his followers, and his kingdom. The military orders of the Crusades answered the call when threat of annihilation was hanging in the balance. In an all-new series, James and Joanna Bogle discuss the heroic efforts of the defense of ancient Christendom.
Europe is attacked from the north, from the south, from the east, and from the northeast as well. We really, literally have attacks on all sides.
So arose the military orders and the Crusades, an all-new series here on the Global Catholic Network, EWTN.
Hello, I'm Joanna Bogle, and with my husband Jamie, we're exploring together the military orders and the Crusades. Today, we're turning our attention to the Iberian Peninsula, Spain, Portugal, and the Reconquista. This is something that people know a little bit about, the fact that Spain had for some 800 years been under the domination of a massive Islamic presence, which was not wholly without benefit to Spain in terms of the great buildings that were erected and so on, but it's a massively important story in European and Christian history.
It is indeed. We have the invasion in about 722, the principal battle, and the Muslim raiders remained there, forming the kingdom, the Islamic kingdom, the Golden Caliphate, under three separate dynasties for the best part of 780, 800 years, until 1492, when Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand finally retake the Spanish peninsula back for Christianity.
That doesn't mean that... Yes.
It's a very long history.
It doesn't mean that the whole of Spain was Islamic. There were Christian pockets within Spain. But it does mean that the whole of Spanish history is really dominated by this Islamic reality. And indeed, Islamic history sees the Spanish era as the most incredibly important one.
It is. It's really the whole history of Spain is so radically influenced by this that most Spaniards at least know something about it, and probably quite a lot of Europeans as well. It's, as we've heard, called in Spanish Reconquista, the reconquest, in Arabic al-Andalus, which means the recapturing. And we've got to remember that before the arrival of Islam, the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, was Christian. It was the Visigothic kingdom of Spain and Portugal, although it was not called that, the Hispanic kingdom, which was the old Roman province, but Christianized, and under the Visigothic kings, the Gothic barbarians had moved in, taken over, and then been Christianized. They began, by the way, as Arians, many of them, and then they were fully Christianized. And that Visigothic kingdom remained and stood. It was a peaceful kingdom. They did not regard Islam as in any way an enemy or in any way as a threat, and they were sadly mistaken, because very quickly they were conquered and taken, captured. And all that was left was a thin strip along the northern territory of Spain, Asturias, where, as we've seen and heard, Don Pelagio began the famous Reconquista with his battle, the Battle of Covadonga. And that was what is seen by many to be the beginning of the Reconquista. But let's just review for a moment where we are with the Islamic rule in the Iberian Peninsula. It begins, as I say, in the 8th century, and thereafter we see the Moors, as they were called, Islamic conquerors were called the Moors in Spain, Saracens in other parts of of Christian Europe, and they sweep over the whole Iberian Peninsula. They establish the Emirate of Cordova, which becomes the center of the Golden Caliphate, and they also establish a foothold north of the Pyrenees in Narbonne, in France. After the establishment of a local emirate, Caliph al-Walid I was the first ruler of the Umayyad Caliphate. And after him we get Tariq ibn Ziyad, after whom Gibraltar is named.
Yes, the what is it? Jabal Tariq, Gibraltar,
yes.
Gibraltar as we call it today. Now a British possession for many years, of course, but named after him.
Essentially means the Rock of Tariq. He was the first governor of the newly conquered province of al-Andalus. That, by the way, is Andalusia, which comes from Vandals, because the other barbarian tribe that moved into Spain, apart from the Goths, were the Vandals. They also moved into North Africa. Al-Andalus, but after Tariq's conquest, he was recalled to Damascus, because at this stage the Muslim rule is still based in Damascus, and he was replaced with another Muslim ruler, Musa bin Nuzar, who had formerly been his superior. Musa's son, Abd al-Aziz ibn Musa, married the widow of one of the Visigothic kings, King Roderick, the one who had actually had his lands captured by Islam, and he established his regional government in Seville. Caliph al-Walid I died in 715. He was succeeded by his, I think, brother, Suleiman ibn Abd al-Malik, known as Suleiman. Suleiman, of course, the same as Solomon. And in the end, Abd al-Aziz ibn Musa's cousin, Ayub ibn Habib al-Lakhmi, became the emir of al-Andalus. Later still, these Umayyads were overcome by the Abbasids, who had taken over in Damascus and moved their capital to Baghdad, and they in turn were ousted by the Barbary Almohads, the Berbers. So these were the dynasties that ruled in Islamic Spain. And
so Spain would be Islamic, largely Islamic except for the coastal strip you've mentioned, while the Pope was in Catholic Italy and the head of the church there, and while France, eldest daughter of the church, was Catholic, while the German-speaking lands were Catholic, and while Britain and Ireland, of course, were Catholic, and indeed producing saints and missionaries going elsewhere. So what we today think of as always Catholic Spain has a different history in its relation to Islam. We need to sort of understand that as we look at the geopolitical and historical map of Europe.
Precisely. This is even before Charlemagne has become established as the powerful king of the Franks, let alone as the Holy Roman Emperor, which doesn't happen until 800.
So before much of the great Christian history of Europe, we think of European Christianity and Christian history.
I mean, at this stage, you've still really got quite a strong Eastern Roman Empire based in Constantinople.
And so while there is an Eastern European empire and much Christianity in Central and Southern and Northwestern Europe, you nevertheless have this massive Islamic presence on the Iberian Peninsula.
Indeed, and as we'll see, it goes on, as we have seen in previous episodes, right the way up to Tours in France. But Islam was then, as now, plagued by constant internal rivalry between political factions, political dissensions, which can usually only be overcome by a very strong, very powerful, and sometimes very brutal and savage leader. And this is why quite often Islam throws up a very brutal leader. It's the only way, as they see it, that they can contain the often very disparate and very hostile factions within Islam as a whole. And existing leaders were always looking over their shoulder in case a powerful general whom they had promoted might in turn unseat them. They didn't have in quite the same way, the hereditary principle that provided a very considerable degree of stability in Western Europe, where the kingship, when the king died, was not up for grabs to the strongest strongman, but went to the eldest son, or perhaps daughter in some cases, depending on what the traditions were. This provided a measure of stability which was often lacking in Islam, because there the strongman often took over once the sultan died, and if the sultan didn't die, then he was given, shall we say, a hurrying push, so that the strong man could then take over. Well, around this time, we see that Don Pelagius, the Lord Pelagius, a Visigothic noble, there he is up on the top part of Spain in that little strip of Asturias, begins a rebellion against the local Muslim governor, Munuza, and gathering all his support, particularly an important ally, Duke Pedro of Cantabria, he then attacks and succeeds in defeating the Muslims at the Battle of Covadonga. The main strength of the Muslim army was absent. Al-Sam ibn Malik al-Kolani, the emir then of al-Andalus, as they're still calling it, this is before it's called the Golden Caliphate, he had crossed the Pyrenees, he'd attacked in France, he'd overrun what was called Septimania, and he seriously defeated Odo the Great in 721, and pressed on, as we see, to Tours. And Abdul Rahman al-Gafigi defeated Odo in Garonne in 732, and Odo turned to Charles Martel, who then defeated the Muslims at the Battle of Tours. Meanwhile, Pelagius, Don Pelagio, is attacking the city of Leon, which is a significant city in the northern west part of the Iberian Peninsula. He makes himself king of Asturias, and he marries Duke Pedro's daughter. And around this time, we begin to see the beginnings of a decline in the Umayyad dynasty. Weakened by a string of defeats, rebellions, revolts, it loses a battle, the Battle of the Zab in 750, and is overthrown and replaced by the Abbasids. And most members of the Umayyad dynasty are then hunted down and killed by the Abbasid leaders of the revolt, again showing the instability, political instability of Islam. And this begins to enable, as it were, there's a crack, a fissure, which enables the Christian leaders and knights to exploit. However, Abdur Rahman manages to escape. He flees to the north of Africa. From there he goes to al-Andalus, and with Berber support, again the Barbary pirates and the Berbers, is able to conquer it from the local governor, Yusuf ibn Abdul Rahman al-Firi. And Abdul Rahman proclaims himself the Emir of Cordoba, and the Emirate of Cordoba becomes great. He does this to show that he is nominally still under the rulership of the Abbasid Caliph in Damascus, or now in Baghdad. But in reality, he is going to set up a separate kingdom in Spain.
And what sort of era are we now in? I mean, using AD?
We're still in the 8th century. Mm-hmm. Still in the 8th century. What happens after that is that Charlemagne, by now becoming a powerful figure, receives envoys from Suleiman al-Arabi, Hussein, Abu Tawa, at the Diet of Paderborn, which of course is in Germany, in 777. And he is invited to come down and attack Abdurrahman, which he attempts to do. But he's unable to conquer Zaragoza by force. He decides to return to his lands, and on the way home, the rear guard of his army is attacked, ambushed and destroyed in the pass of Roncesvalles, or as the Spanish call it, Roncesvalles. And thereby we have the kernel of the story of the Song of Roland. Around 788, Abdurrahman I is succeeded by Hisham I. In 792, Hisham proclaims a jihad. So we're back to jihad, a constant theme when Islam decides to become aggressive. Advancing in 793 against the kingdom of the Asturias and the Franks. King Alfonso II, in about 791 to 842 roughly, decides to expand his realm, this time westwards to Galicia, and during his reign we have a series of Muslim raids which causes the transfer of the Asturian capital to Oviedo. Then we have the reign of Ramiro. This is when we have the famous Battle of Clavijo, where it is said St. James himself appeared amongst the Crusaders and assisted them to rout the Muslims. And this becomes one of the great battles of the Reconquista, Clavijo. And the border begins to move slowly southward thereafter. And the Asturian holdings in Castile, Galicia, Leon are fortified, and in 924 the Kingdom of Asturias becomes the Kingdom of Leon.
So they have extended the Christian part. St. James, of course, is very important. He's the apostle, very much venerated in Spain with his shrine at Compostela, Santiago de Compostela, which in due course will become a great centre of pilgrimage. It is now, but it clearly wasn't in the days when you had to get through an awful lot of Islamic territory in order to reach there.
That is
but
correct.
That's the significance of it.
That, by the way, is where you get the famous, if somewhat gruesome, devotion to St. James the Moor Slayer, which seems to our sensibilities these days a little excessive. But I suppose if you were living at the time and threatened by being enslaved or slaughtered by marauding Muslim raiders, you might have had a different view. We see a change in the Islamic, in the Crusader forces at this stage, and they begin to become comprised of two types of forces. The nobility, the so-called knights, the caballeros, form the principal military force of armed knights. And from the 10th century, interestingly, commoner knights, who are non-noble, also become knights and are often then raised to nobility as a result of their being part of that fighting force. The infantry consists of largely of peasants, the peons, the peones, and the infantry is only goes to war if it is needed, because the war primarily takes place between armed, mounted forces, the knights, and this then we begin to see the familiar shape that we see in medieval society, ranking structure and warfare. Again, principally reflecting the need of that society to defend itself from ever-increasing encroachments from Muslim raiders.
So how does the thing progress? We're still well into the era of Islam in Spain and no end in sight yet.
We are. Now, the Reconquista isn't just a military process. We must always remember that underlying any use of military force is always the aim, the hope among Christians, particularly emanating from the teachings of the Church and the churchmen and the Pope and the bishops of the time, that you will be able to eschew military means and return once again to persuasion, to diplomacy, to law, and not to have to use any kind of military force. So alongside the military program, we also see a program of repopulation, bringing peoples in to mix with the locals and hopefully thereby to befriend them and thus perhaps even convert them. The Christian kings took their own people to locations abandoned by the Berbers in order to have a population which was capable of sustaining a proper defence and also building a civilization. And what we see is that in 929, the Emir of Cordoba, by now Abdurrahman III, and the leader of the Umayyad dynasty, still at that stage in power, declares himself caliph, independent from the Abbasids in Baghdad, and he takes over all power. He then decides that he will try to fight back and to conquer the remaining Christian kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula, attacking them several times and having some measure of success. His grandson becomes a puppet in the hands of the great Vizier al-Mansur, the victorious so-called, and it's thereafter that we begin to see the Berbers moving in and the Almoravids taking over. And they are very much less tolerant towards Christianity and towards the Jews. And they become very aggressive, once again, in their approach towards the Christians and the Christian kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula. And they are only finally defeated at Valencia in 1094 due to the actions of the famous Spanish figure El Cid, the Lord, coming from a Spanish word for the Lord, Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar.
And would you say he was as significant as the legends say? Is he sort of the Spanish Robin Hood, or is there very much more to it than that?
Well, it seems so. It seems that the legendary figure of the Cid was a great romantic, chivalric figure. He never declared himself king. You see, if he'd been a Muslim, he might well have said, well, look, I'm more powerful than the king, and therefore I'm going to oust the king. But he was a believer in the Christian virtue of obedience. So whilst he was the saviour in many respects of Spain, he never once thought of the idea of overthrowing the king. He remained always obedient, and indeed insisted that the king himself obeyed the Christian constitution of the kingdoms over which he ruled, and held the king to his Christian promises.
Not unlike Joan of Arc in France, who insisted that crowning the Dauphin was her mission and not anything more than that, just the restoration of the authentic Christian
Very similar,
monarch.
very similar. Then we see the great battle of Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212 by a Christian coalition of forces, which again defeats the Almoravids, who then lose almost all the remaining lands of al-Andalus in the following decades. And by 1252, only the Kingdom of Granada remains as a sovereign Muslim state in the Iberian Peninsula. So we have moved all the way down the Spanish Iberian Peninsula, retaking kingdom after kingdom from Islam, Portugal, all the way down. So all we have left now is the Kingdom of Granada. And in the High Middle Ages, we see, because this is now coinciding with the battles that are going on in the Holy Land, we begin to see the influence of the military religious orders coming to influence effectively what is a crusade in Spain, the Reconquista. And it begins to take on all of the ideas that we've been discussing so far in relation to the Hospitallers, the Templars, the Laude Nove Militiae, the orders of chivalry. The idea of the Christian knight and chivalry is coming very much to the fore. And this is promoted by the Abbey of Cluny in Burgundy, who actively encouraged Christian knights and kings to defend and extend Christianity in Spain. And the Pope himself leaves no doubts about his approval and his granting of privileges and spiritual rewards for knights who fight for Christianity in Spain. And Urban II, do you remember him at the Council of Clermont, tried to persuade the Reconquistadores fighting in Tarragona to stay there and not to go on pilgrimage to Jerusalem, because he considers that their contribution is already as great by staying and defending Spain. And so many of them, in fact, do.
So you have, as it were, a battle on various fronts, while the First Crusade, as it's come to be called, is going to the Holy Land. At least eventually it gets there. Some of it is a bit of a rabble and gets sidetracked, but when they're going there. Meanwhile, in Spain, there is this a battle at the other edge of Europe. So this does rather complete the picture of a rather embattled Christendom, where the real problems appear to be in the Middle East, but there's also plenty of problems in Spain. And this gives us a rather different image, perhaps, of the era of the Crusades.
And don't forget, in the north, you've still got Scandinavians attacking across.
Who are pure pagans and very, very brutal at that.
You don't really get the conversion of the Scandinavians until around about this time.
It's interesting.
So you've got Europe is attacked from the north, from the south, from the east, and from the northeast as well. You really, literally have attacks on all sides. The idea that what you have is a colonizing, overweening, overbearing, greedy, land-grabbing, money-grabbing force of Christian knights going out for unprovoked to attack another land in order to seize their property is simply a caricature of what really is going on here.
It also interests me that the racial mix of Europe is much richer, because the blonde, pale Europeans are precisely the ones that are the problem. They're the pagans, the Scandinavians, the ones who are likely to cook you alive in your armour, as you so revoltingly and graphically described it. In many cases in the Middle East, you have the Christians, who are the heartlands of Christianity, who are not Europeans. These are devout Middle East Christians. So there's no sense in which Christians would have had any sort of fantasies of racial superiority in that way.
And I think Christianity at that time it's nothing to do with race. This is a much later development that comes with odd and bizarre scientific ideas in the 19th century. It's primarily about conflicts of religious belief. What we also see at this time in the Iberian Peninsula, like the Templars, the Hospitallers and the Teutonic Knights, we see their own individual distinctive military religious orders rising up around this time. And they are the four great orders of Spain. Military orders of Spain, again religious orders. Santiago, the Order of Santiago. The Order of Montesa, which is really follows on from the suppression of the Templars. They then in Spain become the Order of Montesa. The Order of Calatrava and the Order of Alcantara. And these four orders continue to the present day. They now are in the gift of the King of Spain. But they were originally based upon the same idea of the Templars, the Hospitallers, and the Teutonic Knights, religious orders with a core of knights who take the full vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, as well as the Crusader vow. But you also see quite a lot of married knights joining the orders of Calatrava, Alcantara, Santiago, and even in due course Montesa. In that sense, they are a little bit different from the other three orders, who only allowed married knights as confratres. But again, the whole ideal is very much the one of Christian chivalry, service to defend Christendom, and an element of the hospitaller as well. But their task is primarily to defend the Iberian Peninsula and to retake those parts of the peninsula which were once Christian.
We're going to have to speed up because we're coming towards the end, but the Reconquista finally was achieved when?
1492, we finally see Ferdinand and Isabella complete the Reconquista with a war against the Emirate of Granada. Starts in 1482 and ends with Granada's complete annexation in early 1492, the same year when Queen Isabella authorises Christopher Columbus's journey across the Atlantic to discover the New World in America. The last king of Granada, Islamic king Muhammad XII, known as Boabdil, was exiled, and Spain once again is completely Christian as a result of the Reconquista crusade.
So there's this extraordinary sense of history unfolding because Queen Isabella not only sends Columbus to discover the New World with all that that is going to imply that she couldn't possibly have imagined, but her daughter is, Catherine, is married first to Prince Arthur of England, and then he dies before they're even grown up and able to consummate the marriage. Then she marries the younger son, Henry. It must have seemed the beginning of a golden age. It must have, mustn't it? But he was going to be Henry VIII of England, and she, as Catherine of Aragon, was going to be his most tragic queen, and another chapter was going to unfold. So we have that dramatic and amazing story of Spain, and then it yields more chapters to come. We're Jamie and Joanna Bogle, and we've been looking at the military orders and the Crusades. The next edition will see us discussing the later Crusades up to the French Revolution.